The CSE, the Center for Socialist Education, as you know, has been doing programming here for 25 years. The building opened in 1997. We host all kinds of events and activities here, forums, socials, film nights, fundraising events, speakers. Not so much the last 2.5 years because of COVID, but we do host some events here. We're proud to be doing that again. Yves, as you know, many of you already know him. He's one of the most prominent writers and activists in this country who's working in the area of Canadian foreign policy, exposing the myth that Canada is somehow on the progressive side in world events, when it is actually closely tied into the entire imperialist world project, closely allied to Washington, to United States imperialism, and more so all the time. The difference between Canadian and U.S. foreign policy, there used to be some, it is grown increasingly narrow. I'm going to let Yves talk about that himself. He's come a long way from Montreal. He's been touring around British Columbia speaking to audiences. You can buy his books. There's still some left. We'll be collecting donations for the cost of his tour. There's a collection container there. When you're leaving, please put some money in there. Or you can send the donation by e-transfer or some other modern fancy method. Yves, come on up and enlighten us.
Thanks, Kimball, and thanks to the Center for Socialist Education for putting this on, and thanks everyone for coming out. Before I get into my talk, I have to warn everyone that according to the Journal de Montréal, which is the biggest paper in Quebec, on Monday they published a 2-page expose on the fact that I am a Russian propagandist.
Silly.
Yeah,
It's ridiculous.
and to get a sense of how ridiculous it is, this photo here is from 2019. And it's myself and another member of Solidarité Québec Haïti, a member of the Haitian community, who got up on stage to interrupt Mélanie Joly, who was then the Minister for la Francophonie, around Canada's role in Haiti. And in this article, they reference, I bumped into Steven Guilbeault, the Environment Minister, who's the MP in my riding, and I called him a climate criminal. And then I put a video of it online. And so they... Palestine disruptions, Haiti disruptions, Venezuela, climate, it's all just this Russian propaganda plot. But yeah, so anyways, it's I think speaks to a little bit of the climate that we're operating in, and I think we are operating on international issues, particularly in a climate of quite a bit of sort of like McCarthyite kind of thinking, that anyone who says something, that NATO expansion was maybe not a good idea, therefore you're a Putin propagandist or a stooge or whatever. Anyways, so what I'm going to talk about, of course, is Justin Trudeau's foreign policy. And Justin Trudeau's foreign policy is very good at a few things. It's very good at serving empire and serving corporate interests, and it's also very good at hypocrisy and lying and stuff like that. And we see that with the fact that they say they want to abolish nuclear weapons, and yet they vote against holding the conference that more than 2/3 of the world vote for, that creates the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They say they have a feminist foreign policy, but since 2018, Canada has sold $5.8 billion in weapons to the Saudi monarchy. They say they believe in the rules-based international order. They have drastically increased Canada's sanctions regime. Most international law experts view unilateral sanctions as contravening international law. They promise to restart diplomatic relations with Iran. They failed to do that, and now we're seeing relations with Iran very much deteriorate. They say they believe in, they're anti-racist, and yet they continue to be part of this core group of foreign governments that dictate Haitian affairs. And I can get into that in more detail later on if people want. They say they take the climate crisis seriously, yet Trudeau doesn't bother showing up to the recent COP meeting in Egypt, and his former Greenpeace environment minister, Guilbeault, justifies having fossil fuel lobbyists as part of the official delegation of the Canadian government in Egypt. And looking at the climate crisis, we have to always center it around the incredible inequity, right? Where we're seeing 30 million people displaced from flooding in Pakistan, a place that has been responsible for very limited amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you compare Canada to most African countries, it's 10 or tens of times greater per capita greenhouse gas emissions in Canada than African countries. So those who are the primary victims thus far of the climate crisis often are responsible for a very limited amount of the problem. And yet you have the Trudeau government continuing on with a whole slew of fossil fuel projects that absolutely guarantee there is no chance of attaining even the insufficient climate goals that they have put forward. On the question of the ombudsperson to end the most egregious abuses of Canadian mining companies, the Trudeau government promised to bring in an ombudsperson that would have some capacity to end public support, Export Development Canada credits, diplomatic support to mining companies found to be responsible for significant abuses abroad. And what happens? They come up with an ombudsperson that can't even compel testimony from the companies, that can't even requisition documents from the companies. They just have to basically trust the companies. And it acts basically ombudsperson as an advisor to the international trade minister. And of course, that's in the context of Canada's global mining behemoth, where you can pretty much pick any country in the global south, and there's an example of a Canadian mine that has destroyed waterways, all kinds of ecological damage, human rights abuses, etc., etc. And the Trudeau government has really continued this policy of backing up the Canadian mining industry around the world. They continue to provide all kinds of aid money to supporting the mining industry abroad. Obviously, Export Development Canada credit, Trade Commissioner services, the Foreign Investment Promotion Protection Agreements, the FIPA Accords that allow mining companies to sue countries in international tribunal for lost profit. Continue to sign those agreements, and also continue to defend the most egregious Canadian mining companies, right? So a week ago in Toronto, victims of Barrick Gold's operations at the North Mara mine in Tanzania, they brought a lawsuit against Barrick Gold. There have been dozens and dozens of people killed by security forces paid for by Barrick Gold at North Mara mine, or police forces that are housed by the company. In 2016, Globe and Mail reported on a official inquiry in Tanzania that said 65 people had been killed at the mine by security forces financed by Barrick Gold, and a number more since then. And in 2016, 2017, there was a huge dispute in Tanzania over Barrick Gold's unpaid royalties and taxes. Billions, the Tanzanian government accused Barrick of billions and billions of theft from Tanzania, and they stopped Barrick Gold's, they stopped their operations or constrained their operations in the country. Canada's High Commissioner at the time organized a meeting between the president of Tanzania and the head of Barrick Gold. That in of itself, to my mind, was way too much diplomatic support for Barrick Gold. But Ian Miles, the Canadian High Commissioner, came out of that meeting and said, quote, Canada is very proud that it expects all its companies to respect the highest standards, fairness, and respect for laws and corporate social responsibility. We know that Barrick is very much committed to those values. So here you have the most controversial Canadian mining company, Barrick Gold, operating in the place where they have their most egregious abuses, while they have this huge unpaid tax dispute, and the Trudeau government official providing complete Canadian diplomatic endorsement of Barrick Gold's Canadian standards of social responsibility. On the question of Palestine, the Trudeau government has continued this deeply anti-Palestinian perspective of the Canadian government that the Harper government, of course, became sort of infamous for, but unfortunately it didn't just begin with the Harper government. We can go into that if people want to. And there are, of course, many, many facets to this anti-Palestinian policy. They have voted against about 70 different resolutions upholding Palestinian rights. Often these resolutions are supported by basically every country in the world. There was just one yesterday where it was 156 to 9. Canada was, of course, one of the 9. Some of the resolutions go as high as 176 countries voting for, and it's U.S., Israel, Palau, Micronesia, and Canada that vote against them. So this is a really offside of even, Britain or France or many other sort of, European imperial forces. So the Trudeau government has continued that anti-Palestinian voting record at the UN. The Canadian ambassador in Israel, Deborah Lyons, in 2020, she actually organized a pizza party for Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. And at this pizza party, she said that Canada was proud of the Canadians in the IDF. Any country, it would be weird for the Canadian diplomat to organize a party for someone fighting, Canadians fighting in another country's military. That's completely odd. And then in the context of the daily humiliation of the checkpoints, of the displacement in East Jerusalem, the constant attacks and bombardment in Gaza, it's completely outrageous that the Canadian ambassador would celebrate Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. The Trudeau government has sent a letter pressuring the International Criminal Court to not investigate Israel's war crimes. It's expanded the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. The Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement includes the West Bank, occupied West Bank, where Israel's custom laws apply, unlike the European Union Free Trade Agreement. And you have Justin Trudeau regularly talking about the shared values between Canada and Israel, right? As Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and a slew of other human rights organizations talk about or detail how Israel's committing the crime of apartheid. And it's going to be interesting to see if Trudeau continues with that rhetoric now that we have a pretty openly fascist new Netanyahu government, where you have the I believe it's the Interior Minister, who's the head of the Jewish Power Party, who's been found guilty of racism and terrorism, and is only a month ago actually pulls his gun out at Palestinians in East Jerusalem. This is somebody who's incredibly very and also openly homophobic officials in the new Netanyahu government. So it's going to be interesting to see if Trudeau continues to talk about those shared values between Canada and Israel. On the issue that's received the most the foreign policy issue that's kind of probably most in people's minds over the past 9 months, a year, on the question of the war in Ukraine. I obviously consider Russia's invasion as contrary to international law and brutal, but the depiction of the war in our media is completely one-sided. And when we talk about this, that unprovoked Russian invasion, it's anything but. It was very much a provoked invasion, and the Trudeau government was right at the center of that process. And that doesn't in any way, that doesn't excuse what Russia's done, but it certainly makes it more understandable, and it also gives us part of the way out of the horror. And so, how has Canada contributed to escalating the tensions? Well, the first part, to me, what happened on February 24th was that Russia massively expanded a low-level proxy war that had been going on for about 7 years. And there's a number of facets to that. Of course, in 2014, there was to a large extent, popular uprising that ousted the elected president. Canada very much stoked those protests and the ouster of Yanukovych, and it didn't just begin in the 3 months of the Maidan protests, but it goes throughout Yanukovych's whole time in office. And the reason, in large part, was because Yanukovych pushed for legislation around neutrality, that Ukraine wouldn't try to join NATO. And the most egregious examples of Canada's role in that coup was the fact that John Baird, early in the Maidan protests, actually goes to the Maidan Square in Kyiv and participates in a demonstration. So the foreign minister of the Canadian government is participating in a rally, basically trying to overthrow a government. But far and away the most shocking element is that the Canadian embassy in Kyiv was, according to the Canadian press, was used as a base for the anti-Yanukovych protesters for more than a week towards the end of the revolt. That's clearly a violation of international law. That's an interference in Ukrainian affairs that is clearly outside of bounds. But where I would say you put like a more clear cut of Canada being engaged in a low-level proxy war with Russia is with the beginning of the Operation Unifier. And so basically in February of 2015, there's the Minsk II peace accords that are overseen by Germany and France to try to end the fighting in eastern Ukraine. 2 months later, Canada begins Operation Unifier, which is the training of Ukrainian forces that are fighting in the east. So we start significantly supporting a military that's at war with part of its population in the east. And the the Russian embassy in Ottawa puts out a statement at the time, quoted in the Globe Mail and elsewhere, where it says very clearly, what you're doing is you're going to sabotage the peace accord, and you're strengthening the hand of those forces within Ukraine that want to just keep fighting so of course Russia was providing some degree of support. It tends to be exaggerated in our media, but was providing some degree of support for the separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. And so at the moment when Canada starts getting heavily involved in training of the Ukrainian military that's at war, I would argue that's the beginning of the proxy war. And the Trudeau government expanded that. They expanded that by increasing the latitude for the Canadian military. Initially, they were only supposed to be in the west of Ukraine, but the Trudeau government allowed Canadian forces to go closer to the front. They also added Ukraine to the automatic firearms country control list, allowing Canadian firms to sell weapons to Ukraine with less restriction. And so today, I would argue that Canada is basically at war with Russia. It's not like obviously a full-fledged war, but we have Canadian Special Forces on the ground. We have former Canadian troops that have been encouraged by the government to go fight. We have intelligence, significant intelligence sharing. We have, of course, the weapons, more than 1.1 billion in Canadian weapons that have been sent or announced since over the past 9 months. We're still training Ukrainian forces in the UK and Poland. And so the other part to understanding when we talk about it being provoked, or another part, not the only other part, but another part to it, is the whole question of NATO expansion. And at the end of the Cold War, with the reunification of Germany, there were promises made, of course, around not expanding NATO 1 inch eastward, which I'm sure people in the room are familiar with. Immediately, when Jean Chrétien became Prime Minister in 93, just threw that out the window and became very aggressive proponent of expanding NATO eastward, more aggressive than the US government. And that's basically been the Canadian government's position since, right up until today, right? So today we have, we have the NATO summit in Bucharest, that they've repeated that, but 6 weeks ago when you had Joly and Blinken down in Washington and were asked around that, Joly was, yes, Ukraine should be able to join NATO right away, and Blinken being, well, kind of positioning. With regards to Finland and Sweden, Canada apparently was pushing Finland and Sweden to go for attempting to join NATO, and then immediately said, yes, we support Finland and Sweden joining NATO. The Trudeau government in 2017, so 25, 30 years ago, we were saying not move NATO 1 inch eastward. In 2017, the Trudeau government began a permanent, semi-permanent NATO mission in Latvia, right on Russia's border. Right now, we have 700 Canadian troops stationed in Latvia. So the Canadian government has been strong proponent of NATO expansion eastward. Also, of course, they ignore all the U.S. weapon systems that are Poland and Romania that are very threatening to Moscow, and so they've been very strong proponent of the sort of further militarization of Russia's kind of backyard, if you like. And during the NATO summit, the 70th anniversary, Justin Trudeau said, quote, "For 70 years, NATO has been fundamental to Canada's security and defense. In recent years, Canada has strengthened its engagement in NATO, taking on vital leadership roles. Today, Canada is leading NATO missions in Latvia, Iraq, and NATO maritime forces in the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea." So this has been the Canadian government's perspective. This didn't just begin with Trudeau. In my military book, I have all these quotes from different officials, from Lester Pearson, from Pierre Trudeau, people like Jack Granatstein, about just how central NATO has been to Canadian military policy since 1949. So Canada has been a staunch proponent of NATO and expanding NATO. And we can get into that more if people want. Now, while Canada is in this position of being sort of at war with Russia, one of the parts that's most kind of striking about it all is the lack of discussion about how do we get out of this, right? Nothing about negotiations, right? Just 2 days ago, Mélanie Joly was quoted in the Guardian saying that something to the effect of all wars end in diplomatic negotiations, but now's not the time, essentially. But this was actually a step forward, because I don't know if I saw another time where that was even recognized. And her recognize it is partly because the head of the American military 2 weeks ago, Miley, he announced that there should be negotiations. So there appears to be some sort of maybe division within the Biden administration over how much do we continue? Is this the time to try to figure out some diplomatic pathway, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would argue that the Canadian government has been emboldening the most hawkish elements within the U.S. empire on this issue. They are clearly aligned with the kind of UK, Latvian hardline position versus the sort of German, French, Italian that's less sort of let's keep it going forever kind of perspective. That's not the case on another major international issue that's increasingly dominating the news on the question of China. The Trudeau government, I would say, is more reluctant than the sort of hardline elements within the U.S. But they are going in that direction. They are clearly going in that direction. And we saw that with the announcement on Sunday here in Vancouver with the Indo-Pacific strategy, which very much targets China. It refers to China as an increasingly disruptive global power, and says that China tries to bend the international rules to suit its interests, which of course would apply to basically every country. And certainly I think there's once or twice where the U.S. empire has bent the international rules for its own interests. And so on the question in the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is in of itself, Asia-Pacific strategy probably is it's already sort of a propaganda kind of exercise, just the title. They announced that they're going to announce $500 million in military support for the region, more training of militaries in the region. They also announced that Canadian naval vessels will be more present in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, and of course there's the Canadian intelligence, the C-140 intelligence aircraft, which people may have saw that story last couple of days about how it's based in over the last 6 weeks or so. It's been based in Okinawa, and the U.S. base there, and there's been more stories about Chinese planes sort of buzzing it or sort of pushing back against the Canadian Air Force presence. The head of the Canadian military has recently, about 6 weeks ago in Parliament, he announced that both China and Russia saw themselves at war with Canada, and he also said that those two countries, in his words, threaten Canada's tenuous. They will threaten Canada's tenuous hold over the Arctic, right? So very much setting the stage of we're going to be going to. I mean, that's when the head of the Canadian military says, and other countries think they're at war with Canada. He, of course, is also saying that the Canadian military sees itself getting towards a war situation. So that's, I think, quite troubling. I think some of what's comes out, kind of interestingly, some of what's gone on with the on China and the whole sort of the decoupling, the that the friendshoring and decoupling that Chrystia Freeland talked about 6 weeks ago at her with the Freeland doctrine from the Brookings Institution. It's kind of an interesting one from the standpoint of somebody who sort of was politicized in the anti-corporate globalization movement. Part of one element of what people were calling for was somewhat more of a nationalistic economic policies, and not allowing multinational corporations to just have sort of a free hand to go wherever labor was cheapest, or environmental standards were lowest, or regulations were weakest. And in a certain sense, some of what we're seeing play out with this growing conflict that the U.S. empire is pushing with China, there's some elements of that I think that are maybe will manifest themselves. Clearly, this is not coming from a pro working class direction, or for that matter, a pro ecological direction. It's coming from a great power competition that has the possibility of turning into a serious war, and probably Taiwan would be the most likely situation. But it's also, it's interesting to see, I think in the case of China, you very much see the clash of the two major elements driving Canadian foreign policy, which is Canadian foreign policy is overwhelmingly driven by support for empire and corporate interests. And to a certain extent, you see when I say the Trudeau government's being pulled into a more aggressive posture on China, that's because there is a significant faction of corporate Canada that just wants to, sell to the Chinese market, or wants to, invest and profit from the Chinese market. And just a couple of days ago, Manulife bought out a Chinese firm, or $250 million, some like insurance or something like that, a firm in China. So important segments of Canadian capital continue to sort of buy up or buy into the Chinese market. So the Trudeau government has been, and I think obviously significant elements of the Chinese Canadian community is also uncomfortable or opposed to getting into a conflict with China. So Trudeau has been getting pulled in a more aggressive position. Of course, there are the arms firms, and I should say he's being pulled by the Canadian military, by CSIS, by the communications security establishment, being pulled by the factions of the Canadian government that are the most aligned with the U.S., right? The Canadian military is deeply integrated with the U.S. The intelligence agencies deeply integrated with the U.S. And so those are the elements. Global Affairs Canada is a bit more ambivalent about getting into increasing conflict with China. And I think that, obviously in general, getting towards at any point in history, getting towards a conflict between, two major powers is not a good thing, and is dangerous. But in the context of the climate crisis and needing to enhance our sense of international solidarity, that's necessary to overcoming the worst we're going to hit. No matter what we do, we're being harmed by the crisis. But to lessen the worst of the damage, we need international solidarity. And getting into this kind of conflict just pushes that, makes that even more difficult. On a maybe a bit more uplifting note around Canadian foreign policy and Trudeau's foreign policy specifically, we can say that they have been, if not defeated, have taken many blows to their foreign policy in Latin America. And we see that there's a number of different ways. The elections of social democratic leaders, kind of somewhat anti-US, pro Latin American integration leaders in Colombia, Brazil, Honduras, Peru, Chile in over the past year or so, alongside Argentina and Mexico that have had a couple years now. But we see that in a more clear-cut way with their policy on Bolivia, right? The Trudeau government very clearly supported the coup against Evo Morales in 2019 in Bolivia, the first indigenous president in the majority indigenous country. And they supported that coup by they had financially as well as diplomatically, and had individuals in the Organization of American States electoral mission that claimed these irregularities in the counting that provided the fuel to the opposition protest. Those irregularities didn't exist, and that's been shown very, very clear. And it was defeated. The coup was defeated by basically two main things. One, in that the social movements forced the coup government, which kept postponing elections, forced the coup government to hold elections, and then Evo Morales' party won those elections by the vast majority of positions. So that was clearly a blow to Trudeau's policy in the hemisphere, and even a more clear-cut defeat is their policy in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, they of course have instigated this quite remarkable effort to unseat the duly elected president. And that campaign, many facets, but they set up the Lima group of countries opposed to Maduro. They 4 rounds of sanctions. They brought the Venezuelan government to the International Criminal Court. They supported opposition groups. They were at the center of the process of the whole Juan Guaido opposition politician claiming to be the legitimate president. And so Canadian officials played an important role for weeks, they say months, according to a couple media reports, in building support for Guaido within the Venezuelan opposition, but also outside of the country. And the Guaido experiment it's obviously been a failure now, clearly for a while, but in January it looks like it will be formally, put to rest, where the opposition parties that had been backing him are going to withdraw that, and even the U.S. government looks like they're going to drop the charade. Who knows where Trudeau is on that? Is he just going to follow exactly the U.S.? Is he going to continue to claim that Guaido is the president till after? We'll see. But clearly in Latin America, there has been a pushback and a somewhat successful, heavily successful pushback to Canada's effort to basically wipe out the governments that were a little bit socialistic, social democratic, pushing for regional integration. Another positive thing that's happened to the Trudeau government is that the international community rejected their bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council, which I think was reflective of the fact they were saying we don't need another government that's another pro-US, anti-Palestinian government on the Security Council. So in 2012, I did a book called The Ugly Canadian.
Yeah.
Stephen Harper's foreign policy. And here we are talking about the ugly Canadian, Justin Trudeau's foreign policy. And so some people say, well, why is that? And I think why that is that well, first of all, titles of these things are just marketing. So it's a marketing thing, and I'm not that creative. But the issue is that these questions are not about the politician. Even if we had Jagmeet Singh, I think that Trudeau's a little bit less bad than Stephen Harper. Singh would probably be a little bit less bad than Trudeau, but the overarching policy would be the same. And that's because this is not about the politicians. This is about structural forces, institutional, deeply held ideological dynamics. And there, obviously there's many facets to that. As I mentioned, Canada's foreign policy is overwhelmingly about empire. Canada has had and corporate interests. Canada has had a privileged place with the two great empires that have been responsible for so much violence over the last 2+ centuries, British and US empires. We have this mining behemoth. We have a banking sector that's major player internationally. We have, engineering, big player, global engineering, private security industry, on and on and on. So there's important capitalist forces that obviously shape Canadian foreign policy. Then you have as I mentioned, the Canadian military and the communications security establishment and Canada's role in the Five Eyes, obviously Canada's role in NATO. These are important forces that shape policy. Then if you look at in the ideological sphere, the think tanks and academic departments that are funded by the arms industry, by the mining sector. So at the ideological level, and then not to mention just the corporate media and that structure, but specifically in the domain of foreign policy think tanks or academics, you'll find, as I detailed in the propaganda system book, that this is deeply rooted. So we shouldn't go into these struggles naive that if we just elect that politician, all these problems will end. They won't. I think, to me, the only way that these problems will end or will at least significantly lessen the damage done by Canadian foreign policy is by mobilizing, by building the social movements, by building the organizations that are willing to challenge power on these issues. Those organizations do exist. They tend to be small. They tend to not have many resources. But it's a matter of building the social movements, the popular organizations that will demand that the Canadian government doesn't just align with the US empire and corporate interests, and that push towards a foreign policy that's more based upon internationalism and solidarity. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.